You don't expect the worst day of your life to start with lace. Ivy Prescott had spent 19 years hating the sound of her stepmother's voice, and one single afternoon, that voice finally did something no amount of childhood cruelty ever managed. It broke her completely. She didn't know yet that the man walking up the driveway in a charcoal overcoat was about to make sure it never happened again. The Prescott house sat on Larkspur Lane, a pale blue colonial with white shutters and a garden that Deborah Prescott insisted on keeping photograph-ready at all times, as though a magazine crew might arrive unannounced to document her modest, aspirational little kingdom. It was a house that looked warm from the street and felt like a walk-in freezer from the inside, and Ivy had learned that lesson slowly, over 11 years, the way you learn to avoid a bruise before it's finished healing. She was 21 now, old enough to leave, not quite brave enough yet, not with the bakery job barely covering her portion of the rent she paid her own father for a room in his own house, not with nowhere else lined up, not with the ghost of her mother still living in the cedar chest at the foot of Ivy's bed. That chest was the only room in the house that felt like it belonged to her. Inside it was a dress, white silk, yellowing faintly at the seams now, the kind of dress that had been sewn by hand in 1998 by a woman named Margaret Prescott, who had worn it exactly once, on the happiest day of her short life, and who had made her husband promise, 3 weeks before the cancer finally took her, that their daughter would wear it too. Someday, whenever someday arrived. Ivy had been 10 years old when her mother died. She didn't remember much about the funeral, but she remembered the dress being folded into tissue paper by her father's shaking hands, remembered him saying, "This is yours, Ivy Bug. Nobody touches this but you." She had believed him completely. She had no way of knowing that belief was a luxury that wouldn't survive her father's second marriage. Deborah Prescott arrived 2 years later with a laugh like broken glass and a daughter of her own, Priscilla, 4 years older than Ivy, poised and polished and endlessly aware of exactly how much space she was entitled to take up in a room. Deborah didn't hate Ivy loudly. She was smarter than that. She hated her quietly, through 1,000 small subtractions, a smaller portion at dinner, a colder tone at parent-teacher conferences, a habit of introducing Ivy to guests as "my husband's daughter from the 4, as if Ivy were a stain that had been there when Deborah moved in and simply hadn't come out in the wash. Ivy had built a life around the edges of that house. She worked mornings at a bakery called Flour and Bone downtown, kneading dough before the sun came up, and she kept her real life, the parts that mattered, carefully separate from Larkspur Lane. That was where she'd met Dante. He'd walked into the bakery on a Tuesday in February, in a dark wool coat that looked like it cost more than her father's car, flanked by 2 men who stood too straight and said too little. Ivy hadn't known who he was. She'd only known that the espresso machine had jammed, hissing steam at an alarming angle, and that the man in the coat had reflexively stepped between the machine and an elderly customer without seeming to think about it at all. It was such a small thing, a reflex, not a performance. She'd noticed it because nobody in her life had ever put themselves between her and anything. "You're bleeding," she'd said, nodding at his knuckles, which were scraped raw beneath his cufflink, a detail that didn't match the rest of him at all. "It's nothing," he'd said. "It's going to get infected if you don't clean it," Ivy had told him, already reaching under the counter for the bakery's battered first aid kit, because that was simply who she was, the girl who noticed things, who fixed things, who couldn't walk past a wound without doing something about it. Even a stranger's wound, even a stranger who very clearly did not need a 21-year-old bakery clerk fussing over him with antiseptic wipes. He'd let her anyway. He'd sat on the bakery's one wobbly stool while she cleaned his hand, and he hadn't said much, and she hadn't asked much, and something about the silence between them had felt less like awkwardness and more like the beginning of a language only the two of them spoke. His name was Dante Marchetti. She learned that from the card he left with an absurdly generous tip a week later. She learned everything else slowly, the way you learn a language, badly at first, then all at once. She learned it from the way people's faces changed when she said his name out loud, from the black cars that idled outside the bakery some mornings, from the two men who never seemed to eat anything, from the night he'd finally sat her down in his kitchen and told her, plainly, without flourish, exactly what his family did and exactly what that meant for anyone who chose to stand beside him. "You can walk away right now," he'd told her, "and I will make sure you're safe, and I will never bother you again. I need you to understand that before you decide anything." Ivy hadn't walked away. 6 months later, she still hadn't. She loved him with the stubborn, quiet loyalty of someone who had spent her whole life being told she wasn't worth staying for, and who had finally found one person who stayed anyway. She hadn't told her father. She certainly hadn't told Deborah. Some things, Ivy had learned, were safer kept in the cedar chest along with the dress, folded carefully, tucked away, brought out only when she was alone enough to look at them properly. The trouble started on a Saturday morning in April, 3 weeks before Priscilla's wedding. Priscilla was marrying a man named Foster Whitlock, the son of a county commissioner, in a ceremony that Deborah had been planning with the single-minded intensity of a general staging a small war. There would be 200 guests. There would be a string quartet. There would, Deborah had informed anyone within earshot at least 4 times a week for the past year, be nothing tacky about it. There would also, as it turned out, be a problem. Priscilla's custom gown, $11,000, ordered from a boutique in the city, had arrived with a defect in the bodice that the seamstress swore could not be fixed in time. Deborah had spent 2 days on the phone screaming at increasingly junior employees of the boutique, and on the 3rd day, she had marched into Ivy's room without knocking, the way she always did, as though the door itself was simply a suggestion Ivy had no right to enforce. "Get the dress," Deborah said. Ivy was sitting on her bed, folding laundry, and she looked up slowly, already knowing exactly which dress her stepmother meant, already feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "What dress?" "Don't be stupid, Ivy. It doesn't suit you." Deborah crossed her arms, standing in the doorway like a queen surveying territory she'd already decided belonged to her. "The one in the cedar chest, your mother's. Priscilla's boutique gown is ruined, and the wedding is in 3 weeks, and I am not having my daughter walk down the aisle in some rush-order catalog dress because nobody in this house thought to keep a backup." "It's not a backup," Ivy said. Her voice came out quieter than she wanted it to. "It's mine. Dad promised it was mine." "Your father promises a lot of things," Deborah said, and there was something almost bored in the way she said it, the tone of a woman who had won this argument in her head 100 times before she'd ever walked into the room to have it out loud. "He also promised me a kitchen renovation 4 years ago. We don't always get what we're promised, sweetheart. Priscilla needs a dress. You have one sitting in a box collecting dust. I don't see the dilemma." Ivy stood up. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her voice level, the way she'd trained herself to over 11 years of practice. "It's my mother's dress, Deborah. It's the only thing I have that was hers. You can't just... Priscilla isn't even my mother's daughter." "And whose fault is that?" Deborah's smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. "Your mother's dead, Ivy. Dresses don't mean anything to dead women. They mean something to the living people who need to wear them in 3 weeks. Now, I've already told Priscilla it's settled. The seamstress is coming Thursday to take it in. Bring it downstairs." "No." The word surprised even Ivy, hanging in the air between them, small and impossibly heavy. Deborah's expression flickered, not softening, never softening, but recalculating, the way a predator recalculates when prey does something unexpected. "Excuse me?" I said no. Ivy's heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she thought Deborah might be able to hear it. "That dress is mine. It's the only thing I have left of her. You can buy Priscilla 100 dresses. I can't buy a new mother." For a moment, something almost like uncertainty passed over Deborah's face. Then it hardened into something colder, something Ivy had seen before and had always lost to. "You listen to me," Deborah said, stepping fully into the room now, and Ivy noticed with a distant, floating kind of horror that her stepmother's voice had dropped into the register she used when she wanted something to be final. "This is my house. Your father works for me now, and I decide what happens under this roof. And what is going to happen is that on Thursday, that dress is going to be sitting on my daughter's fitting mannequin, whether you agree to it gracefully or whether I have to have your father drag that chest out of your room myself. Do you understand me?" Ivy didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around every word she wanted to say. "Good," Deborah said, as if silence were agreement, and turned and left, her heels clicking down the hallway like a countdown. Ivy called her father that night, but Marcus Prescott had never once, in 11 years, chosen his first daughter over his second wife's temper, and this time was no different. He sighed the particular sigh he always used when he wanted the conflict to simply evaporate without his participation. "Ivybug, it's just a dress," he said, and something inside her chipped away. A small piece she hadn't even known was still intact. "Your mother would understand. She'd want Priscilla to have a nice wedding too." "She'd want me to have this one thing," Ivy said, her voice cracking. "You promised me, Dad. You said nobody touches this but me." "I know what I said." He sounded tired, the way he always sounded when a conversation asked more of him than he was willing to give. "Look, I'll talk to Deborah." He didn't talk to Deborah. Ivy knew he wouldn't, even as he said it, and by Wednesday night, when the seamstress's Thursday morning appointment had been confirmed twice over text, Ivy understood that no one in that house was going to save the dress but her. She called Dante that night, sitting on her bedroom floor with her back against the cedar chest, her knees pulled to her chest, and for the first time in their relationship, she let herself cry while she talked to him. The whole ugly story spilling out. The dress, her mother, Deborah's voice, her father's silence. 11 years of small subtractions finally adding up to this. Dante listened. He didn't interrupt, not once. And when she finally finished, exhausted and hollowed out, there was a long pause on the line before he spoke. "Ivy," he said, and his voice had a stillness to it that she'd learned, over 6 months, to recognize as the sound of him deciding something. "What time is the seamstress coming Thursday?" 10, she said. "Why?" "I have a meeting downtown that morning," he said. "I think I'll swing by your father's house first." "Dante, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said, and something in his tone made her sit up a little straighter, made the tightness in her chest loosen just slightly, for the first time in 3 days. "I want to. That dress belonged to your mother. It's not Deborah's to give away, and it's not Priscilla's to wear. I'm not going to let a woman with a bad haircut and a worse personality steal the last thing you have of your mother because she couldn't manage a boutique invoice." Despite everything, Ivy laughed, wet and startled, into the phone. "You've never even met Deborah." "I know exactly what she is," Dante said. "I've met 100 of her. Get some sleep, Tesoro." Thursday's going to be a good day. Thursday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of morning that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. Ivy stood in the doorway of her own bedroom at 9:45, watching Deborah direct two of the wedding planner's assistants as they carried the cedar chest itself down the hallway, as though even the box that had held her mother's dress for 11 years now belonged to somebody else. "Careful with the corners," Deborah snapped at one of the assistants. "That chest is going in Priscilla's room. We'll use it for the veil after." "Deborah," Ivy followed them down the stairs, her voice thin. "Please, just let me keep it in my room while she's altering it. It doesn't have to go in Priscilla's room." Deborah didn't even turn around. "You've had 11 years to make peace with sharing, Ivy. I don't have the patience for a tantrum this morning. Priscilla, sweetheart, come see. The lace is even better in person, isn't it? Your grandmother would have loved this." Ivy flinched at the word grandmother, watching Priscilla, tall, golden-haired, radiant with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once had anything taken from her, reach into the open chest and lift the folded silk into the light of the living room's bay window. "Oh, it's gorgeous," Priscilla breathed, holding it up against herself in front of the mirror the assistants had wheeled in. "A little dated, but the seamstress said the bones are good. We'll modernize the neckline, take in the waist." "Don't cut it," Ivy said, and her voice broke completely this time. No strength left to hold the crack together. "Please, don't change it. It's the only thing that's still exactly how she left it." "Oh, for God's sake." Deborah rounded on her, and the assistants and the seamstress, who had just arrived through the front door with a tape measure around her neck, all went very still, the way people do when they realize they've walked into the middle of a fight that predates them by years. "This is why I didn't want you in the room, Ivy. You are 21 years old, and you are standing here crying over lace like it's your own funeral. It's a dress. Your mother is not going to rise from the grave and be offended that her granddaughter-in-law—" Deborah caught herself, waved a hand impatiently. "Her stepdaughter-in-law, whatever, is wearing it to look beautiful at a wedding you should be grateful to even be invited to." The room went silent. Even Priscilla, still holding the dress against her chest in front of the mirror, seemed to flinch slightly at that. A flicker of something almost like shame crossing her face before she smoothed it away. Ivy stood in the middle of her own living room, in the house she paid rent to live in, watching her mother's wedding dress get pinned and measured against a stranger's body, listening to the woman who had spent 11 years chipping away at her finally say the quiet part out loud. That Ivy was a guest in this family, tolerated, not loved, replaceable in every way that mattered. And she felt something in her chest simply give out. She didn't have words left. She didn't have fight left. She turned toward the stairs, meaning to go back to her room and shut the door and let this happen the way everything else in this house had always happened, without her. That was the exact moment the front door opened. Nobody had knocked. Nobody had rung the bell. The door had simply swung open on a gust of April wind, and Dante Marchetti stepped into the Prescott living room in a charcoal overcoat, flanked by the same two men who had been standing too straight and saying too little in the bakery on the day they met. And the entire room seemed to lose about 10 degrees of temperature at once. "Ivy," he said, and his voice cut clean through the wedding planner's chatter, through the seamstress's clicking pins, through 11 years of Ivy learning to make herself small in this house. "You didn't answer your phone." "Dante," Ivy's voice came out strangled, half relief, half panic, because she had never once let this world touch that world. And now the two were colliding in her father's living room, in front of everyone. Deborah recovered first, drawing herself up with the particular hauteur of a woman who did not yet understand what she was looking at. "I'm sorry, can I help you? This is a private family event." Dante's eyes moved over the room slowly, the seamstress frozen mid-pin, Priscilla still holding the dress against her body in front of the mirror, Deborah standing between them with her chin lifted like a woman defending a throne. And when his gaze finally landed on the dress itself, something shifted behind his expression, quiet and dangerous and entirely controlled. "That's her mother's dress," he said. It wasn't a question. "Excuse me?" Deborah blinked. "I don't believe we've met. Ivy, who is this?" "Dante Marchetti," he said, before Ivy could answer, extending a hand that Deborah, out of pure reflex, shook before she seemed to fully register what she was doing. "I'm Ivy's boyfriend. I believe you're the woman who's been telling her, for the better part of a decade, that she's not worth as much as the daughter you actually gave birth to." The room went very, very quiet. "I don't know what she's told you," Deborah said, her voice climbing half an octave. "But this is a family matter, and I'll thank you to—" "It stopped being a family matter," Dante said, "the moment you took something that wasn't yours to give away and handed it to someone it didn't belong to." He walked further into the room, unhurried, and Ivy watched Priscilla take an unconscious step backward, the dress slipping slightly in her grip. "I don't care about your wedding, Mrs. Prescott. I don't care about your string quartet, or your 200 guests, or whatever it is you've spent the last year screaming at vendors about. I care about the fact that you are standing in front of me right now, watching your daughter alter a dead woman's wedding dress, while her own daughter cries in the corner of her own living room, and you don't seem the slightest bit bothered by that." "Now listen here," said a new voice. Foster Whitlock, Priscilla's fiancé, striding in from the kitchen where he'd apparently been fielding a phone call, his commissioner's son confidence fully intact and entirely unaware of exactly who he was about to speak to. "I don't know who you think you are, walking into someone's home and—" "Foster." Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sit down." There was something in the flat, even weight of those two words that made even Foster hesitate, some instinct older than politeness, recognizing the presence of a predator in the room, and for a moment, nobody moved at all. Then Foster, apparently deciding his manhood was more important than his instincts, stepped forward and grabbed for Dante's shoulder, a clumsy, half-formed gesture, more posture than threat, and one of the men who'd walked in with Dante moved so fast that Foster found himself sitting hard on the arm of the sofa before he fully understood what had happened. His hand twisted gently but firmly behind him and released just as quickly. No punch thrown, no blood drawn, just a lesson delivered in under 2 seconds. "Foster!" Priscilla dropped the dress entirely, letting it pool onto the floor in her rush toward him, and Ivy, despite everything, felt a small, guilty flare of satisfaction at the sight of her mother's dress, finally out of her stepsister's hands. "Nobody's hurt," Dante said calmly, glancing at Foster, who was rubbing his wrist and staring up at him with wide, chastened eyes. "That was a courtesy. The next man who puts his hands on me in front of my girlfriend won't get one." "You can't just—" Deborah started, her voice shaking now, the first genuine crack Ivy had ever seen in 11 years of watching that woman's composure. "I can, actually," Dante said, turning to face her fully, and something about the stillness in his posture made even the seamstress take a step back toward the door. "Do you know who I am, Mrs. Prescott?" "I don't care who you are," Deborah snapped, though her voice had lost most of its conviction. "You should," Dante said, "because in about 30 seconds, I'm going to explain to you exactly who I am, And then you're going to spend the rest of this wedding being very, very careful about how you speak to my girlfriend." He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That, Ivy had learned in 6 months of loving him, was the most frightening thing about Dante Marchetti. Not volume, not violence, but the absolute, immovable calm with which he explained the architecture of consequences to people who had never once considered that consequences might apply to them. "My family owns half the commercial real estate on the east side of this city," Dante said, "including, as it happens, the building your husband's insurance firm leases its offices in, Mrs. Prescott. We also happen to be significant investors in Whitlock Construction, your future son-in-law's family business, which I understand is currently bidding on the county courthouse renovation." He let that settle, watching Deborah's face slowly drain of color as the pieces assembled themselves behind her eyes. "I mention this not as a threat, but as context. Context for why it might be, let's say, professionally unwise for you to continue treating my girlfriend the way you have for the last decade." "I didn't know," Deborah said, and her voice had gone small, in a way Ivy had genuinely never heard before, not once in 11 years. "Ivy never said." "Ivy never said," Dante repeated, "because Ivy has spent her whole life being taught that what happens to her doesn't matter enough to mention, that she should be grateful for scraps, that her own mother's memory is negotiable if it's inconvenient to somebody else's wedding budget." He crouched down, unhurried, and lifted the fallen dress carefully off the floor, brushing a speck of dust from the bodice with the kind of gentleness that made Ivy's throat close all over again, and folded it back over his arm like something precious. "This dress isn't a family matter, Mrs. Prescott. This dress is the only physical proof Ivy has left that her mother existed, that she was loved, that somebody once made a promise to her and meant it. And you decided that mattered less than lace and a fitting appointment." Deborah opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "I'm not going to threaten your husband's job," Dante continued, straightening back up. "I'm not going to touch your daughter's wedding, though God knows the temptation is significant. I'm simply going to tell you, once, in front of everyone in this room, that this dress leaves with Ivy today, that it never comes near your daughter's fitting appointments again, and that the next time I hear you've made my girlfriend cry in her own living room, I will personally reconsider every single thing I just told you I wasn't going to do." His voice never rose above conversational, and somehow that made it land harder than shouting ever could have. "Do we understand each other?" Deborah nodded. It was the smallest, least dignified nod Ivy had ever seen her stepmother produce, and under any other circumstances, Ivy might have savored it. Right now, she was too busy trying to breathe. Priscilla, still clutching Foster's hand, finally found her voice from across the room. "I didn't know it meant that much to her," she said quietly, and for the first time in 11 years, Ivy heard something in her stepsister's voice that sounded almost like genuine shame. "Mom told me it was just sitting in a chest collecting dust. I would never have asked for it if I'd known." "You could have asked me," Ivy said, her voice raw but steadier now, with Dante standing beside her, the dress folded safely over his arm like a shield. "You could have just asked me how I felt about it, one time, in 11 years. That's all I ever wanted, Priscilla. Not to keep everything from you, just to be asked." Priscilla didn't answer that, but she didn't argue either, and something in her expression suggested it was a sentence she was going to sit with for a while. The seamstress, sensing correctly that her services were no longer required in this particular living room, quietly gathered her tape measure and pins and let herself out. The two wedding planners' assistants followed a moment later, whispering to each other in the driveway with the barely contained energy of people who understood they had just witnessed something they would be describing to their friends for years. Marcus Prescott came down the stairs at the tail end of it all, drawn by the noise, and stopped dead in the doorway of the living room at the sight of a stranger in an expensive overcoat holding his dead wife's wedding dress, his second wife standing pale and silent by the mantel, his stepson-in-law rubbing his wrist on the sofa, and his daughter standing in the middle of it all with tears drying on her face and something that looked, for the first time in a very long while, like relief. "What," Marcus said slowly, "is going on?" "Dad." Ivy's voice cracked on the word, and 11 years of swallowed grievances rose up all at once. "This is Dante, my boyfriend. I should have told you about him months ago, but I was scared of what would happen, and I was right to be scared, because look what happened the one time I asked for something in this house." Marcus's eyes moved from Ivy to Dante to the dress, and something in his face crumpled, slow and genuine. "Ivy Bug, You told me nobody would ever touch this dress but me," Ivy said. "You said it standing right there, 11 years ago, and then you let Deborah take it out of my room without saying a single word to stop her. You knew Thursday was happening. You knew, and you didn't call me, and you didn't come downstairs until a stranger had to do what you should have done." Marcus didn't have an answer for that. Ivy hadn't really expected one. Dante stayed quiet through the family reckoning, standing a half step behind Ivy with the dress still folded carefully over his arm, present, but not intruding, the way he always was in moments that belonged to her and not to him. It was only when the room had gone silent again, everyone processing in their own separate ways, that he spoke, and this time his voice had lost its edge entirely, gentle now, meant only for her. "Do you want to stay and finish this conversation?" he asked quietly. "Or do you want to come with me and let it breathe for a day? Either one is fine. This is your family, Tesoro. I'm not here to make that decision for you." Ivy looked around the room, at her father, guilty and small, at Deborah, chastened but already, Ivy suspected, calculating how to salvage her wedding narrative, at Priscilla, still holding Foster's hand, watching Ivy with an expression that might have been the beginning of an apology if it had another decade to grow into one. "I want to go," Ivy said. "I want to take my mother's dress and go somewhere that isn't this house, just for today." "Then that's what we'll do," Dante said, and held out his free hand. They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, Ivy sitting in the back seat of the black car with the dress across her lap, running her fingers along the yellowed silk the way she used to when she was 10 years old, and grieving in a way she didn't yet have words for. Dante didn't push her to talk. He sat beside her, one hand resting over hers on the fabric, watching the city slide by, letting the quiet do what quiet does best. "Thank you," Ivy finally said, "for coming." "You never had to ask," Dante said. "You called me crying, and you told me what was happening, and you thought that was you asking for permission to be upset about it. It wasn't. It was you telling me your family was hurting you, and I was never going to sit in my kitchen and do nothing about that." "I've never had anyone do that before," Ivy said, staring down at the dress. "Fight for something of mine like it actually mattered." "It mattered," Dante said simply. "Your mother mattered. You matter. I know that's not a complicated sentence, Ivy, but I understand nobody's ever bothered to say it to you plainly before, so I'm going to keep saying it until it stops sounding strange." She laughed, wet and unsteady, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, the car moving through streets that felt, for the first time in a long while, like they were carrying her toward something instead of away from it. "I have a confession," Dante said eventually, and something in his tone made Ivy lift her head, curious. "What kind of confession?" "I didn't just come to your father's house to save a dress," he said. "I came because I've been carrying something in my coat pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and every time I thought about it, I kept thinking it would happen somewhere quiet, A dinner, a walk, something with candlelight and none of the drama we just walked out of. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet box, turning it over once in his hand before he opened his palm to show her. This was not the plan. Ivy stared at the ring inside. Simple, elegant, nothing gaudy, exactly the kind of thing she'd have chosen herself if she'd ever let herself imagine choosing anything at all, and felt her breath catch somewhere behind her ribs.
"Dante,
"I'm not doing this properly," he said, and there was something almost boyish in his voice now, a crack in the careful composure she'd only ever seen him wear like armor. "I don't have a restaurant reserved. I don't have your father's blessing, which is probably for the best given the last hour. I'm not even on one knee because we're in the back of a moving car and I'd probably concuss myself on the door." He paused, meeting her eyes. "But I'm holding your mother's wedding dress, and I'm holding a ring, and I don't think I'm going to get a moment that fits better than this one, even if I waited a year for it. Ivy Prescott, I would like, very much, for you to wear that dress someday, for me, whenever you're ready, on whatever timeline feels right to you. Will you marry me?" Ivy looked down at the dress in her lap, then at the ring in his hand, then at the man who had walked into her stepmother's living room and quietly dismantled 11 years of small cruelties without raising his voice once. And she felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since she was 10 years old, finally, gently, begin to loosen. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time, the sound coming out of her tangled and joyful and entirely unrehearsed. "Yes, obviously yes, you absolute lunatic. You couldn't have waited for a restaurant?" "I told you," Dante said, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that were, for the first time since she'd met him, not entirely steady. "I've been carrying it for 3 weeks. Some things don't wait well." They didn't go back to Larkspur Lane that day. Dante took her to his apartment instead, high above the city, where the light came through floor-to-ceiling windows in long golden bars, and they hung the wedding dress carefully on the back of a closet door, out of the light, the way her father should have kept it protected all along, and hadn't. Ivy sat on the edge of Dante's bed for a long time just looking at it, at the silk catching the last of the afternoon sun, at the ring on her hand catching the same light in smaller, sharper pieces. "I keep thinking about what she said," Ivy admitted quietly. "Deborah, about how I should be grateful to be invited at all. I've spent 11 years believing that. Some part of me still believes it a little." Dante sat down beside her, careful and unhurried the way he always was with her, and took her hand in both of his. "You know what I noticed the first day I met you? You cleaned a stranger's knuckles with a first aid kit from under a bakery counter for a man you'd never met, who clearly didn't need the help, simply because you couldn't stand to watch someone bleed without doing something about it. That's not the instinct of a person who believes she doesn't deserve to take up space, Ivy. That's the instinct of someone who was taught to make herself small by people who were afraid of how big her heart actually was." "That's a very generous read of a first aid kit," Ivy said, but she was smiling now, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm a very generous man," Dante said, "when it comes to you specifically. Everyone else? Ask my accountant." She laughed properly this time, the sound filling the quiet apartment, and leaned into him, and for a long moment they simply sat together, the dress hanging safe in the closet, the ring warm on her finger. 11 years of small subtractions finally beginning to add back up to something whole. Her father called that evening. Ivy let it ring twice before she answered, sitting cross-legged on Dante's sofa with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. "Ivy Bug." Marcus's voice sounded older than she remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I owe you an apology. A real one, Not the kind I usually give. Okay, Ivy said carefully. I let your mother's memory get smaller and smaller in that house for 11 years because it was easier than fighting Deborah about it, Marcus said. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I wasn't. I was just letting you absorb all the cost of it so I didn't have to. That dress should have stayed in your room. You should never have had to have your boyfriend walk in and do what I was supposed to do as your father. Ivy felt tears prick at her eyes again. Different this time. Not the raw grief of the morning, but something softer, something closer to relief. Thank you for saying that. Deborah's not speaking to me right now, Marcus admitted, and there was the faintest, exhausted trace of humor in it. Apparently, I'm supposed to have known your boyfriend was connected to half the real estate in the county before I let her plan a wedding around your mother's dress. I told her that was a strange thing to be upset about, all things considered, and she hung up on me. I'm sorry, Ivy said, and meant it, even now. Don't be. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Priscilla wants to call you. She feels terrible. I think she genuinely didn't understand what that dress meant to you. Deborah's very good at making things sound smaller than they are. I'm not defending her, I'm just telling you. If Priscilla calls, I think it'll be a real apology. I'd like that, Ivy said, surprising herself a little with how true it felt. Not today, but soon. I love you, Ivybug, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. I should have said that more, and shown it more over the years. I'm going to try to do better. I love you too, Dad, Ivy said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she meant that too. Priscilla did call 3 days later, and the conversation was awkward and halting and entirely sincere. The kind of apology that doesn't erase 11 years of small distances in a single phone call, but plants, at least, the first seed of something better. She told Ivy she'd found her own dress, a simpler one, off the rack, nothing that had once belonged to anybody's mother, and that she'd meant what she said about never wanting to take something that mattered that much. I always thought you didn't like me, Priscilla admitted quietly. I never really thought about why. I never really let myself dislike you, Ivy said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said to her stepsister in a decade. I think I was always just trying to survive your mom, and you happened to be standing next to her most of the time. They didn't become close overnight, but it was a start, and starts, Ivy had learned that spring, mattered more than she'd ever given them credit for. Deborah never apologized, not really, not in the full, unguarded way Marcus and Priscilla eventually did. But she stopped, quietly and without acknowledgement, making the small comments she'd been making for 11 years, the ones that chipped and subtracted and reminded Ivy of her place. Ivy suspected that had less to do with genuine remorse than with a newfound and very specific caution around the man Ivy was now engaged to. But she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't much mind the reason. The result was the same either way. The house on Larkspur Lane got, in its own imperfect fashion, a little warmer. The wedding, when it finally came, was smaller than Priscilla's, smaller than Deborah would ever have chosen for anyone, in fact, held on the terrace of Dante's apartment building, with the city spread out gold and glittering below. A handful of people who actually mattered gathered in the last light of a September evening. Ivy's father walked her down the short aisle with tears openly running down his face, and Priscilla stood beside Ivy as an actual, willing bridesmaid. And even Deborah, seated in the second row, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief in a way that looked, against all odds, genuine. Ivy wore the dress, 11 years after her father folded it into tissue paper with shaking hands, 21 years after her mother wore it on the happiest day of her own short life. Ivy Prescott stood on a terrace above the city she'd grown up feeling invisible in silk that had waited patiently through everything, and married a man who had walked into her stepmother's living room without knocking and refused to let anyone convince her, ever again, that she was worth less than she was. "She would have loved you," Ivy whispered to Dante as they stood together afterward, looking out over the skyline, her hand resting on the same silk her mother had once worn. "My mom, she would have loved that you fought for this dress like it mattered." "It did matter," Dante said, pulling her closer. "It still does. Everything about you matters, Ivy. I'm just glad I got to be there the day you finally believed that yourself." Below them, the city lights blinked on one by one, and somewhere behind them, her family, imperfect, repairing, finally trying, waited with champagne and the particular, hard-won warmth of people who had, after 11 long years, finally learned how to show up for each other. Ivy Prescott had spent her whole life believing she was the daughter nobody fought for. It took a stranger's bleeding knuckles, a bakery's battered first aid kit, and one unannounced walk into her stepmother's living room to prove, once and for all, exactly how wrong she'd been. What would you have done if you were in Ivy's shoes? Would you have stood your ground the moment your stepmother reached for that chest? Or would it have taken someone else walking through the door to finally give you the courage? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needed a reminder that they're worth fighting for, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories every week. See you in the next one.